it's Drybear. Last week, Path of Exile .2, Dawn of the Hunt, the new season for Path of Exile 2, launched, and there has been a crazy amount of drama and arguing going on. So today I wanted to get everyone caught up, at least in my audience, on what's going on and give my opinion on where the state of the game is today. Now, the big takeaway here is that, obviously with so many players playing Path of Exile 2 in its onset for basically the early access launch, the rating for 116,000 reviews was 75% mostly positive. However, with the .2 release last week, it has now gone to mostly negative, going under 40% reviews for the game overall. So there's definitely a large backlash on how the game has changed from .1 into the most recent Dawn of the Hunt release. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Now, as far as like the positive end of things, the new class Huntress came out. There are new ascendancies for Witch and for Mercenary and for Warrior that expand the game. They added a ton of new support gems and new skill gems as well. There's also just new monsters, map changes, improvements. And I think overall the game itself has progressed. It's like moved the needle forward, like it's actually progressed the game forward to being closer to release. However, they did make some fundamental changes to the functionality of the game, and some of them were intended based on their own admission, and some of them were not. And 2 days ago, Zizaran, a fellow content creator, did an excellent interview. Shout out to Zizaran, did an awesome job answering questions, staying focused on some of the harder topics, and focusing on some accountability on some things and trying to get answers when necessary, even though sometimes the interview was a little awkward in some of those cases. But overall, I think it's a good reference point for what has happened and the patch that has gone live yesterday. And to give the devs some credit, they are focused on making the game better always, so it is just going to be an ongoing process. And they did mention that some of the changes were intended, some of them were not. And there was definitely, like, as far as the interview goes overall, it did feel like they started out at the beginning of the interview being quite defensive on some of that. And you do want developers to stand their ground. I mean, I think there's definitely a major negative when developers just give players whatever they want, whenever they want, and then they lose all track of vision, the game falls apart and gets kind of confused. So there's definitely some points to dive into from that standpoint.
Well, I don't know that, once again, I mean, we get this question a lot, right, of just the, like, what is the pace of the game supposed to be? And I honestly find it hard to answer that because of the way that, like, there isn't really an obvious way to even quantify that, given that players have so many different abilities. What I will make, all I can say is that if people are unhappy, then we will keep on improving things until they're not unhappy anymore. Because ultimately we want to get the smooth progression where, you start the game, you feel weak, you get stronger, you get stronger, you get stronger, you keep on feeling stronger and stronger. And you have to have that progression where you're feeling more and more powerful as you're going through. So if you're not feeling that, then that means there's something that we have to improve and get better. So it really comes down to okay, if you're talking about a weaker build, well, what build is it? And then we'll be looking into that and seeing what we can do to improve it. We just have to go through these things one at a time. As I said, I don't know that the time, the thing is, the presupposition with this question is that that we have a goal in mind for the amount of time for the campaign. And the implication of that is that the campaign itself is not fun. But it's if that's the implication, then we just want to make that fun, right? It's the campaign should be fun to play. The amount of time it takes, to me, is not nearly as relevant as just make it fun, right? If you aren't having fun, we want to make sure that it is. So that's why, when we're okay, people are saying we don't like the Act 3 areas, make those shorter. It's well, what amount of, I don't think that quantifying that in an amount of time is the right way to look at it. It's here are some areas that are unfun. I'll make those areas fun, and then whatever the duration of time that takes will not be bothering you. And that may result in the areas becoming shorter, but making it shorter is not
Which I think is kind of more of a boilerplate look at what they're trying to accomplish with the game. But because of the changes they made to the functionality of the characters, overall characters got weaker for the progression of the early game, where a lot of people thought that the nerfs and the reduction, the squish that was going to happen with .2 was going to focus only on endgame. You can see a lot of people are struggling with finding builds that are functional. A lot of people have to go glass cannon, and we'll talk about that in a second. The biggest thing that I see from a lot of people, at least online, on forums, on Steam discussions, reviews, and on public forums like Reddit, is that it feels like it's more of a slog. Everything got slower, characters got weaker, which I think exacerbated some of the problems that the game had at its functional core originally. Things like mobs outrunning you or blocking blocking you or pushing you into walls, things getting even harder than they were before, without solving some of the issues that people wanted to see solved, like defensive options like evasion, or more specifically armor getting better, or some of the core fundamentals of the game becoming stronger and more disparate. And you still have a lot of people that are doomsaying right now as well. The devs have a vision to make you go play any other ARPG. PoE 2 is worse than PoE 1 in every single way, and just generally docking on what's going on in the game so far, especially with the early start of like Act 1, 2, and 3 on normal mode. People haven't even made it through that on some, like, just the casual players that wanted to come back to try out the new content. Now, that being said, the devs also mentioned that the campaign feeling worse was not entirely intended.
Because they were also not expecting that. So a lot of people are wondering
if the campaign, to be clear,
that was going to be my question.
That was not our intention.
So
yeah, we
should be more powerful than we currently are during the campaign then.
Well, that one I will have to look at specific cases, right? Because like that comes down to like okay, so like we already did something about that, right? Where we like nerfed Monster Life, and it's possible that we'd have to nerf Monster Life again if that's still a problem. Like that's the kind of thing that we can do. But the thing is that like as I said, like the first thing we heard when everyone was saying this, the first thing we thought was like, what the hell? We didn't even nerf the campaign. Like literally, that's what all the developers were saying. We didn't nerf this. Why is everyone saying we nerfed it? And so like then it's like, well, we found a few things, but like we're still looking for what those things are. And like it's not always necessarily obvious with all the changes that you make and things, because I can absolutely tell you that our goal here was nerf the end game, right? Like nerf no, it wasn't even nerf the end game. What it was nerf the things that were trivializing the end game before you've even managed to get like your items and stuff like that, like just the really trivial easy shit. Like that was our intention.
I mean, there were some blatant fuck ups.
Yeah.
Speaking bluntly, right? Like the minion change was just bad.
And when you say the minion change, are you referring to the rare minions or referring to the player minions? Because those are both of those were incredibly terrible.
Just fuck up. Yes.
Now, there's definitely a case for this with developers. When you make a change and you have 200,000 concurrent players playing your game, there's no way for you to get every single possible perspective on the gameplay overall. There's always going to be things that surprise you. And so things coming into the campaign getting weaker, and I think their goal was probably the right one, in that it felt like sometimes people were going to the ultimate pinnacle boss with the Arbiter of Ash. They were facing him down in under a second. There were builds that were killing the Arbiter of Ash in under a second, and I think like that's just not what you want. Like the pinnacle boss should not be something that gets deleted before he even has a chance to animate at all. That is kind of the goal, is they wanted to squish down the efficacy of some of the hyper optimized builds going into endgame. But obviously the nerfs that they made to the gameplay overall had some impact on the campaign, where most players, if not all players, were commenting on just how much more of a slog, how much slower and how much worse the entire campaign felt even before you get to maps at all. One of the primary issues with this is generally just kind of a direction on what the game's identity is supposed to be. Obviously, they have Path of Exile 1 already, which is a very fast, spammy, teleporty kind of game where you're just blinking all over the place, deleting screens, which is the power fantasy of ARPGs in general and why you play PvE games like this in the first place. When they marketed the beginning of early access for Path of Exile 2, is they wanted this game to be slower, more deliberate, and it seems like, based on their discussions, that they want this game to feel a lot more like a Souls-like, whatever you want to call it, which really just means more discrete and deliberate actions, more dodging, more lined up, more reactionary things. So it's not just spam and delete the entire screen. You have to plan out your build and position yourself properly, but there is a little bit of a divide between that. And the main issue that is being discussed right now, which is important to discuss, is the issue of player movement and enemy movement. How fast the player goes, the availability of being able to move quickly or relocate your character, and also how fast the enemies get. Like, there was a big problem in .1 where a lot of the fast characters could get the haste modifier, which made them even faster. You would get rushed down and surrounded like crazy, and on top of the fact that the enemies are able to shove you with their collision, and how you can't really do combo abilities or even just the big glory abilities because you're constantly having to run away from mobs that are way faster than you. But let's see what the developer thinks about this idea before we go into the changes that they already put into the game.
Yeah, so let's talk about the monster speed thing. So one of the issues that we have is that if monsters are slower than the player, then combat is optional. Like, it's just 100% the case. Like, you cannot, if the monsters are slow, like, anytime the monsters are slower than the player, then you can just run past them and they serve no, like, they don't, like, effectively you can just choose whether or not to engage or not. And, like, I don't think that kind of gameplay is good. Now, there will probably be some areas, like, and the thing is, a lot of the time when people talk about stuff like this, it's like there'll be a few areas that are bad. Like, I know there are definitely a few areas where, like, too many of the monsters are fast. So the Faradin are a good example of that, where, like, when you go to the last areas of Act 2, like, the Faradin are just really, really fast, and there's kind of nothing slow in the area. And so that's an example where, like, we probably want to make some tuning there.
To get more specific, like, I have someone right now literally going through the areas, all areas in the campaign, and listing all the areas that have a disproportionately high number of monsters that are too swarmy or too fast. Right. They're doing it literally as we speak, and my intention after this is to go through. And so, like, I mean, a good example is like the Canopy, right?
Yeah,
the Canopy.
Sure.
The monsters are real fast, and then not only that, you're in a ritual with them in a tight, confined space, and it just, you end up in this kind of moving around with packs. So if you're not fast enough to kill everything, you just get absolutely swarmed.
Which I don't necessarily agree that if there aren't, like, if all the mobs are too slow, the combat is optional. I think there's definitely a concern of people speed running and running to the end of the game and skipping mobs. But at the end of the day, you still have to stop to attack. Most of the abilities and skills in the game either require some kind of setup or have a committed animation. I mean, obviously, some of the hyper-optimized, like, Monk Invoker builds, or some of the Sorceress builds, or even the new Lightning Spear build, though is kind of slow for Huntress, can definitely burn through maps. In general, a lot of the abilities do require you to stop and attack, and most of the incentive for playing the game is stopping to attack the mobs, so you can kill them, get the satisfaction of killing them, but also to collect the loot, to collect the experience, to get the utility that they drop, and to progress through the maps. You have to kill mobs and kill rares and defeat bosses. So I feel like having mobs that can outpace you constantly is not something that is going to make the game better, and I think this is something that they did ease up on a little bit after this interview.
I'm like to have things to actually go and start to address. Like, can I get a gauge on what you think is like where in the game it starts to become a problem, or do you think it's like just straight out of the gate?
Straight out of the gate. Like even the second zone, like the first zone might be okay, but the second zone with the wolves, it's like pretty like instant, where I don't feel like I'm getting that like ARPG playstyle.
But won't we be hurting more players than we're helping with that?
By making monsters
won't that
slower?
Immediately make it? Yeah, won't that immediately mean that, like, a ton of players who actually enjoy the game because the combat is engaging immediately, like, what, doesn't it kill the game for them? Like what I'm saying is, like, it's easy to say, like, oh, you make the game easier and everyone's happy, but it isn't the case. Like, a lot of people prefer the game to, like, actually have some challenge in it.
Now, there's definitely a middle ground that can be achieved here between the difficulty of the game and the accessibility of it. And there's definitely been rampant discussions around what's available. I mean, you see on screen Trial of Sekhmet I was doing on my Huntress today, but obviously the honor system has been hotly debated. It is a system where if you take damage, you eventually will lose the run. There are some builds that are very good at avoiding damage. There are some builds that are not. So obviously some builds that have less animation commitment, like they can be able to clear screens without having to stop or do animations, are going to be preferred in a system where mobs are incredibly fast and difficult to avoid. So I think there needs to be a little bit more flexibility in what the mobs do, how fast they are, how quickly they swarm the player, and what room that creates for build variety in the game overall. And I can certainly see why people are upset about this, because nerfing the character experience from the beginning and making things harder definitely makes the core issues the game had more exacerbated and more obvious. But there's also some things that I think stood out. Now, I'm not trying to single out Jonathan here. I had breakfast with Jonathan at PAX Australia when I was there for Smite many years ago. I've met him. I think that both Mark and Jonathan are doing an awesome job, but I think there's also just going to be a little bit of a humbling aspect in being able to pay attention to what the game is doing now and just kind of take stock of the review bombing that's happening now and try to understand why it's happening and what they can do to make it better.
Like, for example, right? Okay, so here's the thing, right? So every night I go home and I play I like do test runs of everything, right? And it's like, if we made it so that there wasn't any challenge for me in Act 1, I wouldn't play the game anymore. And that isn't helping anyone, right? Like, I need to keep playing the game every night to actually enjoy myself. It's like, if I'm not enjoying myself, then it's like, how can I even develop the game correctly? So on some level, it's like, it has to be fun for me. And I know that if you, like, if you get to the point of having, like, everything just be trivial, it's like, well, okay, like, why am I even playing this anymore? So that there has to be some level of challenge.
Now, there's some truth in that. Obviously, you want the core experience to be good, and I think that there has been many cases in the history of game development where the developers started making a game for other people. They lost sight of the direction of the game, and they didn't really know who they were making it for anymore. They didn't enjoy it. None of the developers liked it anymore, and then the love and interest for the game overall was lost. So I think it's important that they do have that kind of focus as they're working on the game overall. And this might just be a waiting game as they ease up on some of these personal perspectives and experiences that they have with the game itself. Some people are saying there's just not enough way to deal with mobs that are going too fast, and some people say there's plenty of ways to do it. And I think a lot of it depends on what build you're trying to use and what class you're playing on top of that. Another topic that gets briefly mentioned in this interview that I hope continues to get adjusted overall, they did do some changes in the patch that went live to try and make this better, but personally for me, there is a feel-good mechanic in the game right now, whereas you get mini-stunned by melee attacks, so if any enemy hits you, you get mini-stunned, like your character will stutter, and on top of that, there are plenty of enemies that can shove you when their collision gets on top of you. I think this is very obvious with mobs that move very quickly, but there's also some mobs that have large hitboxes that when you run into their collision, their like arms will shove you across the map and move you. And I feel like things like that definitely need to change.
But it seems to regress.
It still happens sometimes.
It seems to just break every
I don't think this is a like balance question. I think it's just a technical, like, we just need to fix some places and.
Yeah, I just wonder.
There is also some desync we need to fix because
there's also that
annoying.
Yeah. Is pushing something you would consider temporarily removing until you have fixed the issue?
Not at all. No. It will make the game feel like dog shit if we do that. Like, there's just lots of things that you need to have. You need to have some pushing in order to make work. Like, I think it's more just specific monsters.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm not 100% sure I agree with that, but we'll move on.
That's because you haven't seen it without it. Like, yeah.
That's fair. That's true.
If we turn off all sources of pushing, it would just be it would be a disaster.
Right.
This is one of the interactions that I saw on the interview that I wasn't really too pleased with in general. I think that Zizaran, as a creator who's focused primarily on Path of Exile for a good portion of his adult life, has had many experiences with the game in general. And I think that the pushing is something, at least in my eye, is generally something that creatives, artists, and things like that will add to the game to make it feel more real, right? Like, if there are some things that add gravitas to the game that if you don't have them in there, it feels fake, right? Like, if there's no explosion effect when you blow up a grenade, it feels like you never even threw a grenade in the first place. So having the enemies be able to push you, I think, is something that does add some meat and potatoes to the experience of the game overall. But I also think that there are some very major problems with being shoved around. This actually was one of the biggest problems the game had initially. They did some minor fixes in .1 that made it better, and in general, there are some things that really need to be fixed as well. One of the best examples I can give of this is Torgol, which has multiple arms and appendages. I think it has 6 arms in total, but this is one of the best examples I can give of the pushing mechanic feeling really bad. And I think if you fought Torgol, you can probably see what I'm getting at here, but anytime you collide with his collision, you can always see your character getting shoved around. Like, you're basically a ping pong ball in this fight, and there are many fights like this one where there are collision boxes that collide with your player collision that cause you to be shoved and moved. And I think things like this need to get a lot better over time, because to me, even though they're not always fully talked about, I think it's something that just makes the game feel really lame, where it's almost like you're, I don't know, like you're just this viscous liquid being slid around the top of a table against your will. And I think it creates a lot of really weird situations that overall make it hard to avoid mechanics in some cases too. Some fights are better at this than others, and this, I think, is one of the most egregious examples of this pushing mechanic becoming a problem for players. Next, let's dive into itemization and progression for the character. There was a lot of discussions around how many currency items you get and crafting items you get. gets, like Regal Orbs being able to roll up your blue items, or Artificer Orbs being able to add sockets to things or add quality to things, or even being able to get the right runes that you need to make your character or your weapons or your armor strong enough in the early stage of the game. And there were a lot of insights that the Jonathan and Mark gave on the perspective of that, and I think there's definitely some disconnects around the experience the players are having in making their character stronger, the amount of loot that they get from drops, how often they replace your armor. So as we dive into this, try to think back on your experience, either if you're thinking about .1 or if you've been playing Dawn of the Hunt, how your perspective is on how much loot you're getting, how many currency items you're getting, how often you replace your gear through the campaign, through Cruel and going into maps, and how easy it is to go through that itemization as we walk through some of their responses.
Because the game is very difficult right now, so you try to keep getting gear upgrades. There is not enough loot. There is a lot of people complaining about not enough drops.
I don't get the same experience of not getting enough socketables personally. Like, I would say that probably 80% of the gear I'd be wearing pretty much through the whole campaign would have sockets like in there. So like if that's the case, then like there must be something I'm not understanding about like why that people feeling that way, because that's just like a totally different experience than what I see when I'm playing myself.
Yeah, I mean,
like
I would love to.
The intention.
Sorry, go on.
The intention is that you use socketables to fix those problems, and it is fundamentally identical to the crafting bench as far as the resultant, like ability to fix issues on your character. Like there's nothing about the crafting bench that really changes anything that way, other than it's being less intuitive to use for new players.
Well, it is a lot
really
stronger.
Well, there's the power. Yeah, there is the power.
Well, okay, so sure, there's the power, but like, I mean, that's a different question again, right? Like, if you're talking about fixing problems, then that just comes down to the values on the mods.
Now, I think there is definitely a good process towards being able to verify, right? Like, you wouldn't want some player to come in and say, well, Sorceress is the worst class in the world, buff everything about Sorceress, because then you want to be able to verify that data. And I think there's definitely some perspectives to be seen here. However, I think there's obviously a big disconnect here between the experience that the developers are having, at least internally, or when they're doing dev builds or different internal builds, versus the experience that players are having. I think that I haven't really found anyone, at least online in discussions, that are saying that they're getting enough crafting items, they're getting enough good items that are dropping, and they're able to modify the items to solve problems that they need, right? Getting enough cold resistance in Act 1, lightning resistance in Act 2, fire resistance in Act 3, getting enough HP or whatever your primary defensive option is, be it energy shield or armor or evasion. It does feel like a lot of people are having trouble like not being able to get enough regal orbs to roll up items, not being able to get enough exalted orbs to trade if they're on a trade league at all, not being able to have enough items to add stats to their current existing items as well, or if they ever get a divine orb, unless they're playing SSF, they never use it for anything because they're not able to do any crafting with it in general. But it was kind of interesting to hear that they weren't, at least in their own personal testing, finding issues with the amount of drop and the progression of power in your character, which seems to be kind of opposite to the experience that a lot of players are having going through the .2 campaign and starting the new league on their new character. I also feel like a lot of people, I mean, this is kind of my experience in even just .1 or .2 for the game, but I feel like I kind of get the gear that I need, and I actually don't make crazy upgrades constantly. I usually will find a single item that I can put a socket into, one good rune into, and I use that for like an entire act or 2 acts, and I make targeted upgrades when I can, but it's not like I'm constantly editing my build, mainly because I don't really get, personally in my experience, I don't get enough crafting items to be able to constantly be rolling the dice on being able to upgrade items and see if they're better than the one that I have. I'm not getting enough base items with the right stats to roll that crafting experience up until you get to maps and you can use the crafting bench more consistently. It just feels like the flow of that, being able to add sockets, add runes, modify the things that you get, or even just like, hey, I need more life, I need more movement speed, I need more resistance. It doesn't feel like that's majorly accessible. I don't feel like it's a major problem for me, but I'm also, someone who's been putting a lot of hours through the game, so maybe I'm not the target audience for being able to overcome some of the experiences using using gearing. Now, in the interview, the devs did mention that they do like that blue items become a little bit more relevant, and they do hope for people to be able to modify their overall gear by swapping items in and out.
The other thing about the tree that can be a bit tricky here is that when you have that problem, like you probably have that problem immediately where you're like, oh, I'm dying to all this fire damage, this boss, I don't have enough fire resistance. The answer can't be like, okay, I need to look at my tree and get some fire resist, because that's too late, right? Like you need to solve this problem more immediately. Right. So having a more immediate solution is ideally what it would be. So ideally there you'd be like, okay, I'm going to swap this item for this item, and or maybe put this rune in, and now I might have another go and have a good time. Where if the answer is like, okay, there's resistance nodes over here, I just need to get 6 more levels so I can get them to then go and fight the boss. Like, I understand there's a level of like, obviously they're good at forward thinking problem solving, but like when you're like in the moment and you're like, damn, I'm struggling right now, what am I going to do right now? It needs to be a more immediate solution. And that's where the passive tree solves it in one regard but doesn't solve it in another regard, and it's important that yes, the runes are there to solve that problem and certain items are there. And sure, it's easy it is not necessarily incorrect to say that those tools aren't as readily available as they should be.
Yeah, if that.
But isn't that just this is the thing I would say about that is like, okay, when you're saying your gear isn't good enough, you're also just saying the monsters are too powerful. Like, it can just be the monsters. Like, I don't think that it needs, like, there's an element here of like you might just be conditioned to wearing rares in every slot all the time, which doesn't have to be the case. Well, like the gear power is entirely relative to monster power. So if you're saying your gear isn't good enough, it doesn't have to be the gear needs to get better. It can just be that the monsters are too hard. Sure,
if you're talking about also like damage and like I said speed, but okay, can you give me an idea then?
But that's important though, because one of the things that PoE 2 has gotten us is that you're not just saturating on rares like halfway through Act 1 anymore. Like, you actually do. And what that actually means is that you have situations where you change from a rare to a magic. In some cases, you're like changing around your gear through the campaign, and it results in way more like gear upgrades as you go through the campaign. Like, there's way more often because, you'll downgrade to a blue, but then you'll find a regal and you'll upgrade it, and then you'll add some more mods and so on. And like, the amount of gear changes that are happening through the campaign is very, very high. And so if we just dropped more gear, then we would lose out on that. And whereas if we lower monster power, then you're improving the we wouldn't need to do that. And once again, that doesn't necessarily say that the gear is in exactly the right place, but what I am saying is that like it isn't just buff items. Like, it is a question of player power relative to monster power.
Which again is kind of counter to my experience as well. Like I said, I honestly even like if you're talking about just making the character and starting the season all the way through to getting to the pinnacle bosses and clearing through the Atlas, I feel like I actually don't hot swap gear at all in PoE 2. I find something that has the right spread of stats, and then I socket it, I put a rune in it, and I use it for a long period of time until I've unlocked enough levels to be able to get a better item. And I end up swapping out maybe potentially my rings or my amulet or my weapon or my offhand, but my gear itself, I feel like you really try to find something that has the right stats with the right roll, you beef it up as much as you can, and then you use it for a long period of time. At least in my experience, I'm not finding that I'm hot swapping gear, going from yellow to blue items to back to yellow, crafting this, doing that over and over. I feel like that's not the experience that at least I'm having in Dot 2, or definitely did not have in Dot 1, but let me know what your experience is on that down below. The next topic that's worth talking about is survivability overall. I think this is something that they are going to have to constantly revisit and make edits to going forward, because it's just something that's just, it's going to be a moving target, a sliding window that they're going to have to try and find the right balance on. In general, I think that this is something that a lot of developers struggle with, and it can go back and forth. There are some games where you get to the point where there's no reason to run defense. I think most players like to go glass cannon. You get to the point where you just try to burn down encounters as fast as possible so you don't have to deal with it. And I think there is definitely an issue with some of the survivability aspects. I mean, even with all the changes we've seen for Path of Exile 2, I still think that armor for like strength-based characters is not up to snuff. There's definitely some things you can make better. And in general, a lot of what people are doing to solve the survivability problem is they're just going through and getting more damage. Like I said, a lot of the Arbiter runs were sub 1 minute. Many of the hyper-optimized builds were getting below 10 seconds, 5 seconds, less than a second, like one-shotting certain bosses. And that kind of like removes the need to have survivability. And this was a big discussion they had in the interview going over, you know, is this something that should stay? Should we have defense? They bring up a lot of arguments around, obviously, if defense gets too far out of control, you get to the point where players are invulnerable, like they have no chance of dying, you remove the risk of death, you remove the threat against them, and so the challenge of combat kind of goes away from that standpoint as well. And I think they're going to have to constantly reevaluate it. However, I feel like there are some solutions they could implement around this as well. If you have problems where players are too survivable, you can put in things that other RPGs, action RPGs, MMOs, and online encounter-based games have solved, like adding enrage timers. So obviously, if there's an enrage timer on a boss, like there's a time limit, it means that you can't just build pure defense, because if you don't reach the time limit on time, that means you don't have enough offense to be able to deal with the fight. So you kind of have to find a balance between defense and offense. You can also do mechanics where if you miss the mechanic, the boss gets scarier and scarier, or there's certain like thresholds and gates you have to hit to be able to do that. I think that the idea of PvE encounters has been explored heavily over the last 30, 40 years, even since the 90s, that there are some solutions that we can solve rather than just every build being glass cannon. On top of that, if you look on the skill tree, there are a lot of builds that rely on being able to parry, being able to block, being able to use armor or defense as offense. And I think if you're going to have a lot of things in the skill tree or in the ascendancy selections that benefit the player for building defense, I think that's something that should be considered. And I know a lot of players out there really enjoy making tank builds work and aren't just trying to run with the build that can burn the boss down the absolute fastest, because obviously one of the things I always say when we're talking about PvE games is a dead boss deals no damage. So if you could just kill the boss fast and burn it down, they don't have to worry about running defenses. And I think it's something that they have to constantly address.
What I felt like then I was like, well, and since I can't really tank, like there are multiple moves here that I can't tank, not just like one big telegraphed one shot, but there are multiple here that I can't tank. So what I did to prepare instead was I went in with so much damage that I just one shot the boss, which is a little bit deflating for me. I would say Arbiter was one of the least fun bosses, whereas I would way rather go in and be so tanky that I can make a few mistakes, and then end up leaving.
It's quite hard to split the difference between being tanky and being immortal. Like, surprisingly hard to get that right. And when I say that, it's because you can regenerate life very quickly. And so if you don't die, like, okay, and the other thing as well is that boss abilities that do those big hits take a long time, right? And like the bosses often can't hit you again immediately afterwards. It's like they'll do their big ability, and it's not like it's going to just immediately follow up with something that's going to chip you down either. So
yeah,
like,
but
if
we
you
can't
fail,
tank them.
No, but what I'm getting towards is that if you don't have something that's going to do a lot of damage at the for those big hits, like we just have to be very careful, because like if like let's say that one of those big hits did only like, you know, a third of your life, you know, something like that. I don't think that then the boss would ever be able to kill you ever, because it would have to effectively be able to do three of those, like of those things before you can regenerate them. So what you're really asking for, and this is something we discussed a lot in the past, by the way, what you're asking for is for a more attrition-based gameplay style, like a more MMO style like thing.
So yeah,
and what you're really saying then is that you want flasks to do way less regeneration, and you want regeneration to be controlled way more in general, and then have a more attrition-based gameplay style. And that kind of just isn't a PoE way of doing things. Now, like, I mean, that could be a thing we could change to. Like, that would be an option that we would have, but it would be like, it would be the balance change of the universe to do something like that. Like, it would be a complete redesign of all the damage and like bosses and like the whole way everything works. Like change to more attrition style would just be like a you know, an apocalyptic level of balance change compared to what we have, for sure. I mean, that's, I guess we're not thinking in those terms at all. Like, we're just like, but okay, sure, you're talking, okay, like, so that question, I would say, only makes sense in an attrition based gameplay context, which is not what we have. So like it kind of means that like the boss doing abilities to be able to the boss trying to win is and trying to kill you versus denying you the loot isn't a different circumstance unless there's attrition, which we don't have. So like, you know, it's
so overall kind of an interesting discussion and seeing where the devs' heads are at. So let's go from like the interview and the aftermath of that, because they did make some very awesome changes in general that really targeted some of the discussion topics that they have, and a lot of this is live in the game already if you're someone that hasn't been playing over the last couple of days in general. First of all, they made a bunch of changes to Act 3 areas, so dead ends, rerouting, making maps smaller. This was a big point of dissension for a lot of people, just how awesome Act 1 felt, how meh Act 2 felt, and how overwhelming and kind of exhausting Act 3 felt. So Drowned City removing a dead end, same thing for Utsal, Apex of Filth with better layout, the bog is now smaller and less expansive, the Infested Barrens having more access points, Jungle Ruins being able to change the exit as they move between the different areas, making that clearer. Some of the variations feeling cleaner and stronger as well. In Chimera Wetlands, being able to make it so you can teleport more easily between checkpoints in the Machinarium and the Sanctum, having checkpoints more available in places like the waterways. So in general, let me know what you think about the current state of Act 3 areas overall that I think hopefully make things better for the player experience in Act 3. There's also kind of a long-standing experience where you could not apply bleed unless you dealt damage directly to a life bar. This is something they didn't even know was happening initially, but they actually did with this patch. They made it so that you can apply bleeds to targets even if you hit energy shield. This did make bleed builds, which were already pretty weak, a lot weaker, because it meant that if an enemy had a large energy shield, there's affixes that do that, you would be unable to apply bleed to it. So now with the update, you can actually apply bleed to targets that have energy shield, which does apply to the player as well, I do believe, so it makes it a little bit more interesting. However, they made it so CI, Chaos Inoculation, makes you immune to bleeding as well, which is a big change. They also made some changes to the stun threshold based on energy shield, and then some jewel options as well, which I think there have been some really nice. I haven't had a chance to play a bleed build yet, but there's a lot of really new additions to the support gems and even some of the hunter skills that focus on bleed as well, and hopefully bleed is in a much better position, but again, I haven't tested it myself just yet. They also made a bunch of changes to Arc and to like Eye of Winter, some like sorcerer specific changes, some hunter specific changes, some warrior specific changes, especially the temper weapon for the new Smith of Kitava ability, making that more accessible, and some changes for ranger issues. People were having trouble with the old lightning arrow ranger build. They also added in an inhibitor gem that allows you to mess with the consumption of charges, which was brought up in that interview. They made some adjustments to Delirium as well, which means that they made the encounter for Delirium last a lot longer. I think they probably need to make some changes to Ritual as well. There's some areas where Ritual spawns where there's not that much playable space, and so hopefully more adjustments to that kind of randomness will feel a lot better as well. The Delirium Fog can now continue expanding while doing other mechanics, which is another great change as well. On top of that, they made some really nice changes to monster speed, which was a big discussion point we talked about in this interview. Many human monsters have the ability to cancel an attack, so they can interrupt their melee attack if the player moves too far out of range, especially for attacks that have multiple hits, which means that they, when they run up to you and they start an attack and you get far away, they cancel it and run again, which means they're constantly keeping up with you. So they made it so that they have multiple attacks that can do this. They swipe left into swipe right. These interrupt events have been primarily removed, which means that once they catch up to you and start an attack, they will finish the attack and then be able to back off from that as well, which means that they won't be able to keep pace with you as easily. And honestly, in my experience, this is a very nice change. Across the board, they kind of removed these interrupts to catch up, just to kind of help deal with some of that as well, which I think is really good. Then they went through a lot of the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 monsters and made targeted changes. Mark did mention that he had someone on the team looking at just the swarminess and the speed of monsters across the game, and I think that this was a good targeted change. They made it so the haste modifier aura for rares no longer applies to monsters that are already fast. It doesn't make them even faster, which I think is awesome. Then they targeted some specific mobs by, again, removing some of that animation cancel they can do to keep up with you, making them slower, making them weaker if they're super fast, so not keeping up with you and dealing damage that way. They modified some of the mobs that show up in Act 2 in the Valley of Titans. They also modified some of the charger mobs in Act 3 that can shove you and just like put you on a skateboard and take you across the map, and they intend to push you to the side instead of pushing you forward. I think this is great. That makes the game a little bit better, so you're not just being run across the map by mobs, but I do think that they need to do more around the shoving mechanic, especially on large monsters like Torgul, like I mentioned earlier, just to make the game overall feel better. They also lowered the amount and size of Chaos Reigns on Viper, just to make it clearer on that as well. And a big change that I was hoping they would do sooner rather than later is the frickin' Chimera. The amount of time you can target and attack him is so minimal from .1. I complained a lot about this back in November, December in general, but they did make it so that the Beast Lord can no longer recharge energy shield while in the air and uses his attacks that make him untargetable a lot less often, and as well as like the campaign experience you have facing him as well. Hopefully this makes it better for the Chimera experience. Next is an issue that I brought up with the Witch review that I had previously, and the idea that you have these reviving minions that have a harsh, staggering mechanic. So the way it worked before, which is something that I knew they were going to fix it at some point, because it just can't possibly work this way forever, because it's just a terrible solution. So the way it worked before is you had reviving minions that were permanent. They would constantly revive. However, there was a major problem with the revive system that when any minion died, it would cause the respawn timer to completely reset. So it would go back to maximum. No minions would respawn. No minions would be coming back to life. And they did mention that they don't like the fact that minions trickle in so that they constantly die, which is true. However, there's a big problem in that, I think the default timing for the respawn timer is 10 seconds. Say you start that timer when one minion dies, it ticks down to 1 second remaining, and then another minion dies, which means that the first minion didn't get a chance to respawn, and the timer resets back to 10 seconds. Then that ticks down to 1 second, another minion dies. Now you have 3 minions that haven't respawned. It resets back to 10 seconds, and now you're 20, 30 seconds out, and this constantly happens to make it feel really weird, like your minions just aren't coming back. This does mean that a lot of the builds have to build into lowering this time. With enough of the skill tree modifications, you can actually make the respawn timer get down to like 4 seconds or 3.5 or something like that, which means that the likelihood of this happening is a lot lower, which is really nice. However, it still has a fundamental problem of if you have staggered deaths on minions, it will reset that timer over and over, making it harder and harder to get your minions back into the fight. So with this patch, what they did is they made it so that when your first minion dies, it sets the revive timer to 7.5 seconds as before, but each successive minion that dies increases it by less and less, which means it doesn't fully reset it. If you constantly have minions dying at a staggered state, there is a diminishing return on how much that timer can fully reset. Lowering and lowering it makes it a little bit more reasonable, which is kind of like a middle ground between having minions have their own timer versus having a complete reset. It's kind of in between. I think that with this timer being where it is, and the fact that you can lower the timer through the skill tree makes it a little more accessible, and hopefully this feels really good. I haven't had a chance to play a minion build in .2 yet, but I would love to test that out and see how that feels overall. And I think this is kind of like a good change for the game, but let me know if you're playing a minion build this season and what you think about the changes that they made to the respawn timer. On the topic of crafting and accessibility of gear, they did make it so you could do runes on casting weapons, wands, and staves, which is a great change as well. They also made it so that you can craft runes, and they added 12 Artificer's Orbs to fixed locations throughout the campaign, allowing you to craft with them more often, which should help alleviate some of the issues of being able to, modify and craft your gear with Artificers, which you'd kind of have to just be salvaging constantly to be able to get enough of them, and even then it feels like it's kind of limited. So adding 12 of them I think is a really good addition. And they also added in 3 new rune types that allow you to solve solve problems your character may have through this. And the combination of having artificers for sockets and then being able to modify these 3 new rune types, I think does help solve some of the problems that they talked about in that interview. So that was a huge mouthful, but hopefully that catches us up and we can kind of keep track on it and keep pace on it going forward as we see how things change. But definitely a rough start to the season for Path of Exile 2. I'm curious to hear what you guys think on your experience with the game so far and how this lines up with the dev interview that we saw, and also just see like what the changes are going to be over the next coming months as we move into May. We know there's more content coming in May, and potentially even have more classes and more gems and jewels being added to the game to make it even more accessible. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about the .2 Dawn of the Hunt experience you're having right now. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.